Hey everybody, welcome to the Brief Room. I'm ABC's Devin Dwyer in Washington on this Monday. Great to have you with us. Our Deputy Political Director, Mary Alice Parks, is here as well. A big new ABC News poll to get into today. A lot on the 2020 race. What issues are most important to voters, particularly younger voters. We're going to get out to Pittsburgh shortly to hear about Joe Biden, his big moment today in the spotlight, the official launch of his campaign. Also talk a little bit today, Mary Alice, about health care, which is such a hot topic in politics right now. One of the sub-headlines from this poll is it is going to drive voters in the 2020 election.
And that's been the case for almost a decade. And so it is interesting to watch it still be top of the list. We're seeing Democrats forge ahead with some Medicare for all legislation. There will be hearings on Capitol Hill starting this week on that bill, and we're going to talk about it all. Let's
dive in right now to the horse race. Everybody's following this field of, what is it? What are we at, 20?
20
plus Democratic candidates
that one's
right
easy
now.
To remember. Nice round number.
It still could grow. We're seeing people rumoring about getting out there into the race. But here's where things stand right now. This is the top 6 or so from the new ABC News Washington Post poll. No surprise, Joe Biden, with the big name recognition there, comes in atop our very early poll, we should say, 17%. Bernie, of course, Bernie Sanders, 11%. There's Pete Buttigieg right in third place right now. Of course, he's been riding that wave of support. And then a whole number of folks, they're crowded in at about 4%.
Right. I think it's important to give some caveats to this poll. It's hard to talk about someone as a front runner when they only have 17%. Obviously, the majority of Democrats still say that or the largest percentage of Democrats still say that they have not made up their mind. So we expect these numbers could change many times. You know, Bernie Sanders and the former vice president enjoy a lot of name recognition. People around the country know who they are. So that alone might be enough to secure them those top spots.
And even as we take a close look at Democrats in this race and we hear about dissatisfaction with President Trump, his approval rating in our poll at his historic 39%. It's a historic low. There's some interesting facts here, Mary Alice, among registered voters who aren't ready to commit yet, either way.
You're exactly right. So it might sound like a paradox, but even though a majority of Americans say they do not plan to vote for the president, 55%, there are still signs in this poll that he might get enough votes to win. Because remember, winning the popular vote is not how we elect presidents in this country. You have to win the Electoral College. And so when you look at some of these sort of more granular numbers, 45% of registered voters say they would still consider giving him a second term. He only won 46% of registered voters in 2016, and that was enough to secure the White House. And I was also struck by this number of those Democrats and Republicans and independents who rule him out altogether. Only 29% say they would definitely support the Democratic nominee. So they're still keeping all
their
options open.
Keeping their options open with the president's approval rating. There you see it at 39%. Let's dig in back with Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, our two frontrunners for now. We'll call them frontrunners for now. A big generational divide has opened up between those two candidates. Take a look at this number. This was striking. Among all American voters right now, voters under 30, take a look at this. They break for Bernie Sanders over Joe Biden, 13% to 3%. But when you take a look at older voters, voters over 50, swings the other way. Perhaps not a surprise because Vice President Joe Biden is sort of a middle ground kind of a guy, more of a moderate Democrat, also been around a lot longer. Bernie has his loyal followers.
And it's always been something interesting.
That's going to be a tale of the Democratic primary.
Absolutely.
Right
and it was the case for Bernie Sanders in 2016 as well. He was able to capture that youth vote in the Democratic Party. Remember those campaign rallies where it was all those college kids and millennials and younger who were fans of the Vermont senator. It'll be interesting to see if he can maintain that youth vote going forward, because we know that younger voters are voting a much higher percentage than they have in the past. We saw a double-digit increase in the youth vote in 2018.
But will it be enough to lift any of those Democratic contenders in that field? Because they're historically lower numbers of participation among younger voters. We will see if we're in a new era right now. Our political director, Rick Klein, is tracking Joe Biden today. He's out in Pittsburgh today. Rick, great to see you out in the field. So, you know, the selection of Pittsburgh for the official rollout for Joe Biden really says a lot about him and the candidacy he is looking to launch.
Yeah, the location is the message. And if you look at the room behind me where Joe Biden is having his first campaign event, it is filled with union workers. This is a Teamsters Hall right here on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, very working class neighborhood. You see firefighter signs, their union just endorsed as well. And this is an emblematic region. This is about the Trump voters that may have voted for Democrats in the past, abandoned them in 2016. Joe Biden's core appeal is, I can win them back. And talking to voters who were lined up here hours early, they love Joe Biden, and they are convinced that folks in Western Pennsylvania, blue-collar Democrats, and throughout the industrial Midwest can come back into the fold, but many of them think that maybe Joe Biden is the only Democrat who can do that.
You know, we've already heard the president out on the attack against the former vice president. Seems like he's skipping right over the primary right now, and he is already ready to run against Joe Biden. What do you think that the former vice president needs to do at this rally to start responding to some of those early criticisms from the president?
It's interesting because Joe Biden in some ways took the president straight on in his launch video. Charlottesville imagery calling out the president's leadership directly. But what he has been saying really since then is that people know who the president is and I am who I am. He is running against the president, but so far isn't trying to go every joust for joust, punch for punch against President Trump. I think that's going to change, and you think Democrats are going to be asking a lot of questions. What do they see in a candidate who knows he can go nose to nose with a guy that has proven himself to be quite a fighter?
And Rick, before we let you go, right out of the gate, the vice president having to take head-on the Me Too movement and some concerns about his behavior in the past. We've covered that extensively here. Obviously, I want to put up an op-ed from one of the first women who came forward to talk about how Joe Biden had made her feel uncomfortable. This is Lucy Flores. She wrote in the New York Times today about Joe Biden. She said he's not a villain, he's not an unlikable person, not a sexual harasser or an assaulter. But also, as Anita Hill recently found out, not exactly sorry either. She went on to say most reasonable people understood that the kind of behavior with women violates not just their bodily autonomy, but also demonstrates a lack of basic understanding of social norms. And she says, what do we do when the offender hasn't bothered to take the first step toward forgiveness? There was a lot of dissatisfaction, Rick, with Joe Biden's answers to some of these questions on The View last week. What is his campaign saying about it now?
Well, they're going to have to clean it up in some ways because he's going to be asked about these until it gets right. And as the national anthem about to get played behind me, he's going to be asked these questions everywhere he goes, I think, until the question is answered right. All
right, Rick Klein, thanks for us in Pennsylvania, our political director, rather. Let's bring in now for a little more on Joe Biden, Sarah Frostenson, with our team at 538. Sarah, it's great to see you. You're joining us from New York. You were writing today about the electability of Joe Biden. Democrats want to know, they want to pick somebody who can win against President Trump. What are you seeing out there in the data about whether Joe Biden can do that?
Right. So Biden really has entered the field as a polling front runner. It's not a tie between him and Sanders. He's polling on average around 28%, and Sanders is at 20%. And so he's not a formidable front runner by any means, looking at the polls, but he does have a lead, and that gives him a greater odd of winning the nomination. He's also the best performing Democrat when it comes to head-to-head polls against President Trump. There have been 9 since Sanders first declared on February 19th. And in those polls, Biden has led Trump by 7.1 points in a head-to-head, whereas Sanders has only led by 3.5 points, and then the other candidates are tied.
You know, we've heard Democrats really split over the issue of the best way to beat President Trump. Some say that you have to bring out the base, appeal to key Democratic coalitions, and others say no, the best way forward would be to win over independents and swing voters, especially in some of those swing states. And it's been interesting to watch Democratic voters kind of play pundit over the issue. Do we have any evidence or information about which path is more viable for the Democratic Party?
Well, so what we do have in terms of information is an understanding of who Biden could reliably court as his base. And so what we know about the Democratic Party is about 50% of voters either say that they are conservative or moderate. And then another 50% are over the age of 50. And as the ABC poll showed today, that's who Biden's polling well with. So there's definitely a path for him to lean into the more moderate, older Democrat and pave a path to the nomination.
Yeah, Sarah, I want to ask you about that generational divide, the age divide. We had it up earlier from the ABC poll, but it's interesting because those of us certainly inside the Beltway, on the coast, we look at the numbers, we see the enthusiasm among younger voters, millennial voters. There seems to be a lot of engagement. Pete Buttigieg, for example, a millennial candidate, drawing a lot of support. And yet Joe Biden is not someone that seems to be drawing and tapping into that, drawing a lot of support from that. Is that going to be a problem for him, do you think, in the primary?
Well, it's hard to say at this point, but one thing we do know is that younger voters under the age of 30 make up a smaller percentage of the electorate and generally turn out in smaller rates. Granted, we saw record turnouts in 2018 and could again in 2020, but I wouldn't say that that's necessarily at this stage a reason why Biden couldn't put together a winning coalition drawing from other groups. He's also, for instance, polling really well among African American voters.
And we are, as we've seen in our politics lately, just a little bit, we're kind of in uncharted waters, and the old expectations and certainly old assumptions about who turns out, who votes.
And how much of the vote you need to win. If there's 20 candidates being debated in the Iowa caucus, you might be able to succeed with only 20 or 30% of the vote.
Really smart analysis from Sarah Frostenson and our team at 538. Sarah, thanks for coming in. Appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
And we should say, as you just saw there on the screen, Joe Biden has an exclusive interview with Robin Roberts on Good Morning America tomorrow morning on GMA. Speaking of the Democratic primary and the Vice President of the United States, Mary Alice, health care, top priority for Joe Biden, top priority a lot of Democrats. It is another topic that was big in our new poll.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see that the president is struggling here. You know, you'd think that maybe Republicans would want to answer some of that pressure that was put on them by Democrats last fall. We saw the Democratic Party really run on the healthcare issue, and yet it doesn't feel like Republicans have made up a lot of ground. In our new poll, it showed that by a margin of 17%, Americans said that on the issue of healthcare, they're more likely to oppose the president than support him. That's not a good sign for an incumbent hoping to win a second term.
And maybe not for someone who says they'll unveil their plan after the election. That's why one reason why we've seen a lot of Democrats quick to be rolling out and endorsing a lot of different health care plans out there right now. One of which, of course, is the Medicare for All plan, Bernie Sanders' signature plan. A number of presidential candidates have signed on to it. This week here in Washington is the first week that that plan will get a hearing on Capitol Hill on the House side. We'll see if they can move that legislation forward. And today, Mary Alice, you went out and caught up with a group of healthcare providers that are actually endorsing this plan.
Yeah, it's the largest nurses union in the country. 150,000 nurses represented in this union. And they sort of came to Capitol Hill to show their support for the bill. Today, they were protesting in front of a big pharma research center, literally laying down in the street there in D.C., just a few blocks from Capitol Hill. They said that on this issue, they think that high cost of health care and private insurance is deadly. And they say that based on their experience, they want to support a Medicare for All legislation.
And let's take a listen to some of the people you met today.
You should not have to choose between food, paying rent, and having health care. We believe health care is a human right for everyone. We're National Nurses United, the largest union of registered nurses in the country at 150,000 registered nurses.
When do we want it?
Now! What do nurses understand about this issue that other people don't?
Nurses are at the front line, and so they see every single day patients that have to cut their pills in half, have to make decisions on whether they can pay the rent or the mortgage. And what we see are the end result where they have had to make those decisions and are sicker and in the hospital longer because they couldn't afford their treatments.
What made you want to use your personal time to become a political activist?
We're dedicated to the health and welfare of our patients. That's what we do.
And this is the only answer, Medicare for All?
It has to be. I've been a nurse for over 40 years. My colleagues have been in nursing for over 25 and 30 years. We've seen what happens when people can't get the health care that they need.
Why are you convinced that this is the answer?
It has to be the answer because we know that it works. We know that it works for the system that's in place right now. We just want to expand it so that everyone is covered.
All right, a lot of buzz around Medicare for All. What do people actually think about it? For more on that, let's bring in Liz Hamel. She's the Director of Public Opinion and Survey Research at the nonprofit and nonpartisan Kaiser Family Foundation. Joins us by Skype. Liz, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in. So help us get a pulse on what people are thinking about Medicare for All. How popular is it based on the research you've done?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. We have been polling on the idea of Medicare for all, or even before it was called that, the idea of a single-payer health insurance system for a really long time. And we found over the last year or so, a little more than half of the public supports the idea of a national Medicare for all plan. That's sort of your baseline level of support. But when you start digging a little deeper and asking people what they understand about it and how they would feel if it might take away private insurance, you find people have a number of concerns related to what might happen under such a plan.
Yeah, what are the biggest concerns? To your point, when, for example, Kamala Harris, one of the Democrats running for president, threw out there that she wanted to eliminate the entire private insurance industry, a lot of people got spooked by that early on in this campaign, but really that is a key component of switching over to this program. What else are you seeing about concerns people have?
Yeah, we saw that in our polling when we told people that a plan like this might eliminate private insurance. We saw that support dropped. Other common arguments that a plan like this could lead to long waiting times for certain procedures, that also significantly decreased support. And the idea that it would increase taxes is also a negative for a lot of people. You know, on the other side, people like the idea that it's a plan that would cover all Americans, and they like the idea that it would eliminate them having to pay premiums and out-of-pocket costs for coverage. So you can sort of shift opinion on this in different ways depending on which aspects of the plan you emphasize.
Yeah, a lot of the nurses that I spoke to today talked about the gaps that people find themselves in between jobs when it's hard to get insurance for a year. You would think would be supportive of that idea in practice, but obviously would have, or in theory, but it would have a complicated sort of practice.
Yeah, and I think some of those things that you mentioned are things that the ACA was designed to address in terms of, for instance, having protections for people with pre-existing conditions so that they would be able to get coverage if they lost coverage through an employer. On the idea of young people being able to enroll on their parents' plans, a lot of those things were really popular about what the Affordable Care Act did, and people like those types of protections. So there are a lot of things like that people would like to see, improvements and protections. They don't necessarily care about whether you get there through a Medicare for All plan or through some other type of system.
And what does your experience tell you, Liz, about how public perception can sort of shape our politics on this? Usually it goes one way, but it can go the other way. I mean, with Obamacare, Republicans were fanning the flames of fear around what the death panels and what the law would do. And now we see the pendulum swing the other way. People are very happy with the system that's in place. They don't want it repealed. Could that inform a battle around a single payer? Could the fears around that eventually be assuaged to widespread support for it?
Yeah, I think we're definitely at the beginning stages of the public sort of understanding what might actually be the components of a Medicare for All plan, similar to where we were before, the ACA was really a reality. And I think for the public, there's a limit to how much they are ever going to truly understand about the policy details of these kind of things. And they're really going to look to their party leaders to decide how they should feel about some of these proposals. We see that with the Affordable Care Act, even among Republicans, many of them like a lot of the things that the ACA did, but when you call it Obamacare, they say, no, of course I don't like that. I think we may see a similar thing evolve in the Medicare for All debate. People might rally around the idea, even if they have concerns about some of the individual pieces that they don't understand as well.
Just at the beginning of this fight, no doubt. And Liz Hamel with the Kaiser Family Foundation, thank you so much for coming in, Liz. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
I do think that one of the interesting side effects of the Affordable Care Act is the average healthcare consumer seems more informed. There's a conversation around drug prices and co-pays and deductibles, and the more that consumers kind of dig into the details of their bills, the more they might push their leaders to figure some of this out.
That is a legacy, I think a good legacy of the Obamacare fight of just a few years ago. So many people had to educate themselves about all of these things. Thanks again to Liz. Moving on now, taking a little bit of a different turn after we're coming off this weekend where self-professed white supremacists stormed a synagogue in San Diego, killing one, injuring several others, the latest in a series of attacks on churches, mosques, synagogues in this country, also latest in a series of attacks by self-professed white supremacists. The suspect was a 19-year-old nursing student who espoused hatred of Jews. And we're just receiving word now here at ABC News that law enforcement officials in Los Angeles have said they are disrupted another plot now in California to attack houses of worship. So clearly these threats are continuing. Our ABC News Homeland Security contributor John Cohen joins us now by the phone. John, this is a real troubling turn just in the past few weeks and months here, especially if we look out around the globe in these series of attacks on houses of worship.
Yeah, we really are in the middle of a very significant period of heightened threat. And while the motives of these attackers and the motives of those people that we're hearing about being arrested by the FBI may seem to differ slightly, they really are part of a growing trend of individuals who are disaffected, mentally unwell, violence-prone, who are informed by what they see and hear online. They're searching for some sense of social connection and self-worth, and they eventually self-connect with some ideological cause or grievance and use that cause or grievance as the justification for a violent attack. And a number of these attacks, both that you referenced just a moment ago, the one in San Diego, or near San Diego, and the arrest that was just mentioned, involved individuals who either conducted an attack or intended to conduct an attack against a house of worship. So it's an issue that really has law enforcement concerned, and it's something that I think, unfortunately, we're going to continue to see manifest itself.
There's been talk and evidence that the latest attack was committed by someone who was acting by himself. We've heard this term, a lone wolf, and law enforcement talk about how hard it is to track and fight against those lone wolves. Talk to us about that challenge when people aren't a part of some larger organization.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, we used to, our primary concern going back 5-6 years ago were people that were recruited by terrorist organizations, trained by terrorist organizations or domestic extremist groups, and who carried out attacks along with other people from that terrorist organization or domestic extremist group. Today, what we're seeing is a very, very different threat. These are individuals who become inspired by what they see online. They don't have operational communication, or they're not collaborating with people in an organization. They're not joining an organization. They're conducting or plotting attack on behalf of an ideology. We hear from people very often that you can't stop these types of attacks. That's actually not true. The FBI and law enforcement has learned a lot about the dynamics of these attackers. There are things we can be doing. It's just a different type of threat, and you have to address it differently than we have traditionally sought to address domestic terror or foreign terrorist attacks.
John, stand by. I want to bring into the conversation Rabbi Ron Simmons from Pittsburgh, a community that knows attacks on houses of worship very well. Unfortunately, Rabbi Simmons, great to see you, sir. As we all know, back in October, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was the site of one of these attacks. 11 were killed there. How does a faith community rebound from something like that? How's yours doing right now?
Well, this is such a trying time. The attack in San Diego came just 6 months to the day after the attack on the Tree of Life building, the Dor Hadash synagogue, and the New Light synagogue. And people are really traumatized by it. We are terribly concerned that this growing wave of anti-Semitism, which is anti-Semitism as a and also a symptom of a larger hatred is giving more license in public discourse so that people can talk about it, people can print about it, and people can act upon it. Our job here at the JCC, the Jewish Community Center of Greater Pittsburgh, the Center for Loving Kindness and Civic Engagement, is to help everyone understand that we need to define the term from a geographic term to a moral concept so that we can all be in this together. An attack on any one minority, an attack on any one segment of our community is an attack on all of us, and we all feel it deep down inside.
And take that ethos one step further. I mean, how do you, carrying that mindset forward, how do you confront threats, lurking lone wolf threats of violent white nationalism and white supremacy? How do you do that?
So I am not an expert in law enforcement, and I don't claim to be in any way at all. What I do claim to dabble in is the ability to connect people to one another and to help them to understand that just because someone looks different than you, or prays different than you, or loves different than you, or lives in a different neighborhood than you, or comes from a different country of origin than you, or has a different ethnicity than you, that it doesn't make a difference. That we are all connected to one another, whether you believe that that is a God-given connectedness or that is simply our shared humanity. As residents of the United States of America, we have a responsibility to ensure that we can care for each other. I believe that the more that we spread that message, the more exposure, the more attitudes will change, and the more the behaviors will change. We have to be sitting down at tables with people who come from different places, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and physically from us.
Well said. You mentioned the national discourse earlier. I want to get your opinion on Washington and politicians right now. Do you feel like you're getting adequate response, or have you been worried that politicians are exacerbating this problem?
Well, we all know that a part of the way that the system is supposed to work is that the people that we hire to represent us in Washington, D.C., and in our state capitals and in our local city capitals are supposed to be doing the work of the people. I would encourage every lawmaker on every level, no matter their political, their partisan affiliation, to stand up and not only to say the right words at the right time, but to begin to pass the legislation that is going to ensure that people can be safe, can be emotionally safe, can be economically safe, and can be physically safe.
Rabbi Ron Simmons, thank you so much for joining us for those very poignant thoughts, important thoughts, a very important message. Before we close today, I want to go back to John Cohen on the phone, because John, sort of to button this all up, what is something that all of us can take away and do ourselves to confront this lone wolf threat that continues to grow?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing a rise in public expression of white supremacy, and we have seen an increase in levels of violence associated with these extremist ideological beliefs, unlike anything I've seen in my 32-plus years in law enforcement. Driving factors of this, based on my conversations with law enforcement, is the use of social media and internet that's interconnecting people that were separated in the past, spreading hateful rhetoric, using those platforms, sharing information about targets and critiquing past attacks. Secondly, as the rabbi and you were discussing, the rhetoric in Washington, the rhetoric that's become a part of our political discourse, is actually serving to inspire people to violence. So what we can do is, one, when we observe behaviors of concern exhibited by people that we know or by people that we know that are posting online, report it to law enforcement. And then secondly, we all need to urge our leaders to think about the language they're using and understand that the same language that may inspire a political base to action may be inspiring disaffected, violence-prone individuals to violence.
John Cohen, ABC News Homeland Security contributor. John, thank you so much for that. Well said also.
Scary stuff. But I really appreciated the rabbi's message about taking time to get to know people that are different than you and trying to bridge those gaps.
Really important indeed. Much more to come here on ABC News Live this afternoon, including later on tonight, an exclusive look ahead at Robin Roberts' sit-down with former Vice President Joe Biden in Pittsburgh. Much more to come on that. He just made some news, so check it out at abcnews.com. Download the ABC News app. If you don't already have it, follow us. We'll be back here tomorrow, 3:30 Eastern Time for the briefing room. Great to have Mary Alice. As always, I'm Devin Dwyer. Hope to see you then.